Aê, estamos ao vivo, galerinha. Seja todo mundo bem-vindo. Hoje nós temos a grande presença do doutor Coulson, nossos amigos aí, Francesco, Giovanni, Cristiano. Galera que estiver chegando aí, marreta o like aí. Quem não é inscrito, já se inscreve no canal. Hoje é super interessante o tema. A gente vai dar a palavra aí para o Francesco, para o Giovanni, para o Cristiano, com a introdução, né, em inglês, então vai ser totalmente em inglês, e aí depois a gente faz arruma, coloca em português, né, a gente faz aquela tradução depois no final. Então, tô dando a palavra para os meninos aqui, quem estiver chegando vai marretando o like, a gente não vai ter interrupção, e aí fica aí na mão do pessoal. Tamo junto, pessoal!
Okay, so first of all, thank you so much for being here with us. Thanks so much for sharing a bit of your time with us to talk about evolution, ecology, zoology. So we just want to ask you to give a brief introduction, to talk a bit about yourself, who you are, what you do.
Of course. Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me on your podcast. It's a real pleasure and a real honor. So I did visit Brazil many years ago, but one day I will hope to come back and visit. So my name is Tim Coulson, and I'm a professor of zoology at the University of Oxford, and I'm also head of the biology department. And I'm also a popular science author. I've recently published a book called The Universal History of Us, a 13.8 billion year tale from the Big Bang to you, which is actually being translated into Portuguese, so will be available in Brazil in the not too distant future. But my research interests and what I'm interested in doing is I study both ecology and evolution. And I'm particularly interested in what happens when you change the population size of top predators in ecosystems. So what happens when you lose predators or you introduce alien predators into ecosystems? And the reason I'm interested in that is throughout the world, we're impacting predator populations. Sometimes we have eradicated them, sometimes we've brought them back. And when we get rid of them, we often see very significant changes across ecosystems. So one of the places I work is in Yellowstone National Park, where initially wolves and mountain lions and bears were eradicated in the 1920s, and then we reintroduced them in the 1990s, and we've studied them since. But I also work in Trinidad, where we have study sites in freshwater streams, and in those streams, in some streams, there are predatory fish like wolffish and pike cichlids, and in other streams the predators are absent, and we look to see how that influences the evolution of fish called guppies and also killifish. And then the third place I work is do comparisons between mainland Australia and islands off Australia, where on the islands, there are no predators, but on the mainland, there are predators of birds. And we look to see how the birds have evolved over hundreds of thousands of years. So that's what I do. That's what I enjoy doing. And I love talking about science and enthusing people about science and encouraging people to do science.
I think that most people have been introduced to this topic, Yellowstone wolves, by YouTube video, because there was a YouTube video many years ago which went viral, which the title was something like How Wolves Change Rivers, if I remember correctly. So could you talk a bit more about this type of research you did?
Of course. So the video you're talking about, I think, has had more than 10 million views on YouTube. It was recorded by a man, a journalist called George Monbiot, and he recorded it quite a long time ago after a paper was published that made arguments that the wolf reintroduction to Yellowstone had led to huge changes through the ecosystem, that forests had started to come back, aspen trees and cottonwood trees and willow, and that as these had come back, it meant that beavers had increased in number, and they'd started to build dams, and this meant that it had actually led to the rivers changing course. Now, unfortunately, quite a lot of that video is as we've done more research, the video is a bit exaggerated in terms of what happens. It is true that Yellowstone has changed since wolves have come back. It's true that elk numbers, so deer-like species, have decreased in population size by about 2/3. It's true that bison numbers, so bison are sort of large cow-like animals, that their numbers have increased fairly significantly. But it's not true that the forests have now returned to cover the floors of the valleys. Certainly in some areas, we've seen recovery of trees a little bit, but not so much in others. So it's quite patchy. And of course, it takes a long time for forests to come back. So it would be very surprising if they had come back in the 10 years that they claim in the video. In fact, beaver numbers, there were some reintroductions outside beaver numbers, and beavers come and go. But actually, a recent survey that a colleague of mine, Dan McNulty, did revealed actually there are very few beavers at the moment in Yellowstone, partly because it's quite dry and it's been dry. So there have been changes, and having wolves on the landscape is excellent. I think it's really positive. It's increased tourism to the park. Lots of people like to come and see the wolves. But it's not just the wolves that have caused the change. So since the wolves have come back, and which were reintroduced in 1995 and 1996, mountain lions have also, a bit like cougars or a bit like jaguars, large cats. Since they've come back to the park, though they came back to the park at around the same time that wolves were reintroduced. Now they colonize naturally. And although there's not as many mountain lions as there are wolves in the park, there's about half as many, they're twice as effective when they hunt, so their kill rate is about twice as high. And bear numbers have increased as well. So grizzly bears are more common than they used to be. And the grizzly bears will eat baby elk a few days after they're born. They're able to catch them. So it's certainly true that Yellowstone has changed. The rivers haven't really changed course as was claimed there. And Yellowstone continues to change. It's now probably a bison-dominated system rather than an elk-dominated system. And trying to understand those changes is really exciting and really a really important thing to do. And it's one of the things that I research. But one of the challenges of somewhere like Yellowstone is we only have one Yellowstone. We only have one national park. So we can't do an experiment where we say we have a Yellowstone where we didn't introduce wolves, or several of them replicated, and we don't, and then a number of Yellowstones where we reintroduce them. So what we try to do in my research is to take data collected from Yellowstone, to use those data to build models of the ecology of the park, and then hopefully those models capture the dynamics, so capture what's going on in the park reasonably accurately. And then we can do experiments on the computer with those models to try and work out, for example, how important wolves are and how important mountain lions are. And that's some of the research that we're doing at the moment. We're building those models and parameterizing them to answer those questions. So I don't know, does that answer your question? It might have been a bit of a long answer. I don't know.
Yeah, it was a really good answer. I'm sorry, it's a bit noisy here, but it was a really good answer because it's really important to have someone to fact check what is being shared on the internet, because many informations are being shared, and usually experts don't have time to deal with the process of fact checking all the information which is being shared on the internet, So we have this problem of stuff which is said, which is not completely true, and goes on unchecked.
Absolutely, and it's a problem all over the world, and it's certainly a problem. It's interesting what's happening with Twitter, or X as it's now called, because it's in the news around the world that X is now being banned in Brazil because of Elon Musk not paying fines or not paying fees. I don't know the full story, but the problem that this being the head of the guy who owns Telegram has been arrested in France, is on trial for not removing harmful fake news. So it is a real issue, and it's probably not a good idea for people to get most of their information from Twitter or from X or from Telegram. It would be much better if they're able to go to sort of more trusted news sites or the literature to find out what's going on. But sadly, I think social media is here to stay with us, and people would, of course, keep using it.
I think that Cristiano had another question about Yellowstone.
Okay.
Não, era só uma questão técnica, porque como ele falou, e aí atiçou a curiosidade, de saber se, quando você tem, por exemplo, uma reintrodução de uma espécie que havia sido extinta num determinado local, aquilo pode dar certo, como de repente foi o caso da reintrodução dos lobos no parque, mas também pode dar errado, por mudanças, dependendo do tempo em que aquela espécie foi retirada, das próprias dinâmicas entre as populações naquela comunidade. O que, de repente, quão de repente a experiência da reintrodução dos lobos em Yellowstone é diferente daquilo que já foi tentado em outros locais, em termos de reintroduzir essa espécie.
Posso perguntar?
Vai, traduz.
Well, in this case, Cristiano was asking about how unique or how different is the reintroduction of wolves in Yellowstone when compared to other reintroduction events of local extinct species, because sometimes it may pass enough time and enough generations for the ecosystem to change and not be necessary the reintroduction of top predators, for example, or a population of a top predator that were not regionally extinct can take this role in the ecosystem.
No, that's a good question. So, and I think sometimes, so you're absolutely right. Ecosystems tend to sort of settle on a stable state. So what I mean by that is there's a set of species that, if left alone, particularly if there's not at the moment we're changing the world a lot, and there's a lot of climate change, but certainly over evolutionary time, there would be thousands of years, tens of thousands of years when ecosystems probably didn't change very much. They had the same species, they had the same sets of species. There wouldn't be much extinction, there wouldn't be much recolonization. So in Yellowstone, for example, before humans arrived, there would have been a group of species that had been there interacting with one another in a reasonably stable setting. So, of course, from one year to the next, the numbers go up and down a little bit, but ecosystems have a tendency to go to a stationary state, so a state where they're reasonably stable. Now, and things are adapted to living in that ecosystem, so they're adapted to the other species that are there. There may be some evolutionary arms races going on, but they're generally quite well adapted. Now, when you remove a species and it's away from the environment, it's off the environment, out of the environment for a long time, other species will evolve. The ecosystem becomes rewired, is the phrase that people use. And that means that species interactions change. And as those species interactions change, evolution can occur. So just leaving Yellowstone aside for a second, but talking about where we work in Trinidad, when we remove predators from a stream, or we take fish, herbivorous fish, small fish that were evolved to live with predators, and we put them further up a stream, on the same stream where there are no predators, and we leave them there for several generations, they evolve because their numbers increase, and they now, instead of being limited by predators, when they live with predators, they will die in the jaws of a predator, they will get eaten. But when you then take them to areas where there are no predators and release them, they start to become limited by food. So there's not enough food to go around. So instead of dying by being eaten, the fish are dying from starvation and not getting enough food. And what happens is, over the course of sort of 10 to 30 generations, we see evolution where the fish metabolic rates slow down, so they can't swim as fast. They change their diet. Instead of feeding on insects, invertebrates, rather, in the water column, they now start feeding on bacteria and algae. And so that they actually evolve a different jaw shape. Their life history changes. So they don't start reproduction until they're older and larger. And once they've evolved to live without predators and they're adapted to living in an environment where there's not much food, if you then were to introduce predators to that environment, the fish will go extinct, the guppies will go extinct, because they can no longer live with predators. So if you put guppies that are adapted to live without predators into an environment with predators, they all get eaten. And so one of the dangers is, if you take a species, an influential species, out of an ecosystem, a keystone species out of an ecosystem, and you leave it away for long enough, then it's very difficult to rebuild the ecosystem in the way that it used to be. Now, in Yellowstone, humans, the Americans, early Americans, in the early 1900s, they deliberately tried to get rid of the bears, the wolves, and the mountain lions, because the people who lived around the park, who were livestock farmers, didn't like them there because they were attacking their cattle, they were attacking their sheep. So clearly they didn't like having these predators there. But in Yellowstone, they were only off the environment. These predators were only away from the environment for 70 years, which is only a handful of elk generations. So that meant the elk hadn't adapted to live without predators. They'd still got their predator responses. And so when the predators came back, the ecosystem is tending towards the state where it was before, but it might not go back to exactly the way that it was before, because of climate change, because there's more people around Yellowstone now, there's lots more tourists going in. And so although it's getting closer to where it was before, it might not go back exactly. And so you can, restoring lost ecosystems can be quite difficult. But the second part of your question is, if you can't bring back a species that perhaps has gone extinct, can you bring back a species that plays a similar role in the ecosystem? So, for example, if bison were driven extinct in an area, could you replace them with a cow or something similar to that? And the answer to that is, up to a point, yes, in some places you can, but it will still be a little bit of a different ecosystem to the one that you had before. Does that answer your question?
Perfectly. And I believe we got a national example for something like very similar to what happened to wolves. And there are some reintroduction programs about jaguars, because jaguars regularly attack cattle.
Yeah.
And farming and cattle are one of the main sources of our economic growth. So there's a lot of retaliation. But big farmers, which have enough money to compensate for the cattle loss, the individual losses, are in some places of Pantanal and Cerrado working in ecotourism specifically to observe jaguars, which are indeed by a very popular species, one of the symbols of our biodiversity, and way more popular in cities like the populations of big cities and than in the rural areas, because, well, we who are living in metropolis don't have problems with jaguars regularly, so we appreciate the beauty, their imponence, and there's like a strong symbolic connection to these animals. So there are some initiatives independently occurring in Brazil to compensate for some losses in agriculture with ecotourism.
No, it's great to hear about projects like that. And in fact, I think there are two sorts of things that go on. You're absolutely right that people who live in cities like the idea of big carnivores and jaguars and lions and wolves wandering around the countryside because they don't come into contact with them. The people who make their living off, as you say, livestock in particular, really, or the people, losing pets or what have you, or livestock to jaguars, of course, they have a very valid point. I mean, if you're a farmer and you're trying to raise livestock, it's very difficult for you and very upsetting for you if you lose your animals to carnivores. There's no doubt about it. But I think in some parts of the world, as you say, and it's a nice example, I hadn't heard that example. I will go away and find more about it and read about it. But it's people are learning to live side by side, large predators, but also the large predators are learning to live with us. And I think that's an important thing. So, they're learning that we're dangerous and that we're to be avoided. And they're very good at not being seen and being ghosts on the landscape. So many times when large carnivores have been radio collared, you'll see that at night they will go through almost like ghosts through sort of villages and small towns and what have you. And so, yeah, things are adapting, things are learning to get used to us and to avoid us. And so I think there are some really positive stories out there, and I think we have to remember the positive stories as well as all the bad news, because people if people know there are solutions and we can learn to live with big dangerous animals, and they adapt to live with us, then at least we have some hope for biodiversity for our children and our children's children.
And I would like to add a little thing that it's easier to work with charismatic megafauna. Jaguars, lions, elephants, things like that are very popular. However, there are some animals which are not very well seen by most of the public. And I can cite the example of the bushmasters, the largest vipers in
Yeah.
the whole Americas. And a person of my lab, Tabata, she is now pursuing her PhD. It has done her master's in bushmaster conservation, focusing in a thing that my advisor calls human dimensions. Hugo Fernandes is my advisor. He has worked with hunting, like the impacts of hunting, and mainly with mammals. But her work has shown a remarkable advance by cooperating with the local communities and is starting to change the image of this animal because it's way more calm than we expected. As a very shy creature and is helping to demystify some things the populars believe about it. Oh, and it even is being useful to the taxonomy of the genus now. So there is the genus Lachesis. Yeah, and we trying to talk only about Lachesis muta, which is the main species, like the type species. I believe in English would be Lachesis muta.
Mm.
But now they're describing a new species of the northeastern Brazil population and may even be one exclusive to our state.
Fantastic. And it's, I mean, great to hear stories like that. And in fact, in Trinidad, where we work, we have bushmasters as well, and fer-de-lance. Is it Lamaria you call? I think there's a name I can't remember, but another viper. And most of the time, they're scared of people. They will disappear when you come through the forests. Maybe in the mating season, the fer-de-lance is a little bit more aggressive, but we have worked in the forest there for a long time. We see them every now and again, but fortunately we've never had any issues with them. They're beautiful animals, an important part of the ecosystem, and they will normally slither out the way. So I'm really excited to hear that, to hear your colleagues' research project, and I look forward to reading the papers when they come out.
So
I just want to say sorry because it's becoming really noisy here, so I have to go. But I really enjoyed the interview here, and Giovanni can ask you more questions, but I really have to go. Sorry again. Thank
No
you so
problem.
much.
Very nice to meet you, Francesco. Nice to meet you, and I hope we our paths cross again.
Oh, thank you so much indeed.
Fala, meu querido. This guy is pretty essential to combating pseudoscience in Brazil. Like,
Okay.
he's the man that did most of the articles and stimulates us to discuss about it. Like, he is a central figure. He moves us,
Excellent.
I would say.
Well, that's great to hear that because yeah, challenging pseudoscience is really important, and unfortunately, there's a lot of it around, and it's interesting. I think that the scientific method is how we find out facts. So we make observations, we come up with hypotheses, we come up with experiments or ways to collect more data to test those hypotheses, and we do it again and again, and eventually things like evolution become a fact, and they are a fact. Evolution is as true as gravity, is as true as electromagnetism or the fundamental forces. We can measure it. We know how to measure it. We know how to measure its rate. We understand what genetic mutations are, how they occur, how they build up genetic variation, and how that gets selected, for example. But people distrust of science for two reasons. First of all, there are a group of people who don't like the findings of science. So it's still crazy that there are still people around today who argue against evolution being a fact. They say it's just a theory or it's a flawed theory. I thought that died with Darwin. But there are some dinosaurs, prehistoric dinosaurs, who still hold views from the 1800s, sadly. And the other reason is some people see science or see that science is being used to generate weapons or to do bad things. Now, that's not science's fault. That's the way that science is used, because lasers can be used as a weapon, but they can also be used in surgery for really positive things. And I think what a lot of people don't understand is that the whole process of science is finding out facts, and then it's really shouldn't just be up to scientists, but it should be up to the whole population, the whole the public, to work out how science should be used. And there are some things that we should ban. I think there are some types of genetic engineering that I think we haven't thought through enough, for example. And so until we've thought through and thought what the implications are and the ethics of that, then we should be very cautious about that. But the modern world exists as it is today because of science. We have science to thank for that, and it has increased our knowledge amazingly. We compared to what we knew 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, our knowledge has grown exponentially, and it's an incredibly powerful approach to finding things out, and it's a real privilege to be a scientist and to use the scientific method to discover things and to discover new facts. And it excuse me, and it really annoys me when people deny the power of science or fail to understand it, or try to argue that what science has proven isn't true. And I know that there are some anti-evolutionists, including one who went to Oxford in Brazil, and unfortunately it's completely unacceptable when people who have been studying evolution and should know better then come back and start making statements that are factually incorrect and misleading to try and and they often go hand in hand, these sorts of people who come up with conspiracy theories about vaccines, which is appalling. Vaccines save lives. There's very little risk around them, and other things like that. So I have no sympathy or no tolerance for people who behave like that. It's absolutely appalling.
I would like to pass just a little of theme to talk about your book. And I believe the main question is what motivated you to write the book, The Science Only Exists, reminding for the public, for the audience, that the book has been translated into Portuguese. So those who are not into English may read it anyways, probably in this year and the next year.
Yeah, that's right. So what the book does is, its title is The Universal History of Us, and the subtitle is A 13.8 billion year tale from the Big Bang to you. And I'm a scientist at heart, as you have probably guessed. I love science, and when I was a young man in my late teens, early 20s, I'd become an atheist. I was brought up going to church, but I decided, I saw the light and became an atheist. And having become an atheist, I then got malaria, in fact, and I nearly died. And the doctors said that if they hadn't treated me, the next attack would have killed me. And so I thought, what do I want to do with my life? You know, I was maybe about 21 when I had malaria. And I thought, I want to have as good an idea of what science can tell us about why I exist, because I no longer believe in a God. So I started reading very, very widely. But then life got in the way. I had a family, I got a job, I became head of department, but I kept on reading. And then in 2021 and 2022, I was on sabbatical. I had a year's sabbatical in Australia. And I thought, if I don't write this book now, I'm never going to write it. So I wrote the book, and I wrote it really for me. I wanted to know whether I could write this book, whether I was able to do it. And so I sat down and I wrote it. And the first chapter is about science and what science is. How does it find out facts? And then it tells us, it goes through the history of the universe in chronological order. So we start at the singularity that was the Big Bang, and we explain how the universe was very hot and very simple then. And then as it cooled in the first fractions of a second, the first four fundamental forces, so that's gravity, electromagnetism, and the strong and weak nuclear forces emerged, as did quarks and electrons. And then they managed to, the quarks combined to form protons and neutrons in the first atomic nuclei. When the universe was about 380,000 years, they combined with electrons to form the first atoms of hydrogen. And then the first stars formed, and at the death of those first stars, heavier elements formed. And then second and third generation stars formed of hydrogen, and that's when planets formed, including the Earth. And then so the Earth formed about 4.5 billion years ago. About 4 billion years ago, life started. It's just very complicated chemistry. And it's spread, it's hung on. Sometimes it nearly was wiped out, but it's hung on. And eventually, of course, consciousness evolved. And then later on, we evolved and we emerged. And so the book covers all of this. And throughout it, when I asked the question at the beginning, at the birth of the universe, was it inevitable that we would exist, that the four of us would be having this conversation now? Or are we incredibly lucky and have we won the cosmic lottery? And so there are some physicists who believe that the universe, if we were to run the universe again, you and I, we would all be here having the same conversation. They say it's deterministic. But a lot of people believe it's stochastic. So there's a lot of chance, a lot of randomness involved. And so I weave that through the book along with my own personal story. And if you want to know the conclusions I come to, you'll have to buy the book and read it.
Of course, it's necessary. But I like that you already entered into the realm of talking about the nature of the universe, if it is deterministic or stochastic. But following this area, I would like to know, in your view specifically, that if we could rewind history of the life on the planet Earth going through the same major geological events, would biodiversity be similar to what we have today? This just a little add-on is that this is a very frequently asked question by my professor of the evolutionary discipline. I believe that almost every undergraduate exam he does this same question about it.
So
So
it's a very good question. And I think I'm going to phrase it slightly differently. So I think there are two key questions. And I think the first question is, let's just imagine, rather than thinking about rerunning the clock and Earth, let's think about another planet, other planets in in the universe, in our galaxy and in the universe, in other galaxies. So the first question is, how likely is it that life will begin? So that life, that organic chemistry becomes life. And we've only observed life on one planet, ours, but we've only looked in detail in very, very few planets. We've been to the moon, we've sent rovers to Mars. We haven't found signs of life there. Maybe some people speculate that there may have once been primitive life on Mars. Some people claim that some of the moons of Jupiter and Saturn may actually have life there. My hunch is that life is not hugely unusual. It evolved on Earth. I don't think there's anything to suggest that our planet was hugely unusual or is hugely unusual in the universe, or the conditions on Earth were massively unusual compared to other planets. And there are so many planets just in our galaxy, 100 billion odd stars, I think it is, maybe more. Most of them have probably got planets, so that's even more planets. There's a lot of opportunity. So the question really is if life starts, is it going to diversify? And I think the answer to that is yes. And I think the reason is in the way that evolution works is there's competition. So there's competition for resources, but there's also competition to find new resources that existing life isn't using, to find a niche that life isn't using. Because if you're able to exploit a new niche, then your population is going to grow and you're going to multiply your genes. And so the reason that life is so diverse on Earth is because of that process. It's because the first life would have been chemostatic. It would have been using things like sulfur dioxide from hydrothermal vents or hydrothermal fields. And it got quite good at using that. But then it would have diversified and it would start to use different environments. And then eventually, the bacteria cells, those single cells that became a resource for other cells as and then predation arose. And once you start to get predation arising and things like that, you start to get arms races. And those predator-prey arms races are incredibly important for the evolution of complexity, at least in our branch of the tree of life. And so I think that once life gets going, it's inevitable that it will diversify and that it will spread, and in time will basically, will cover the planet and cover the globe. And I don't, as I said, I don't think the conditions on the early Earth were so remarkable and so unusual that life has only evolved once here. I think it's evolved in many places. And then going to people who, say, well, we're special, life's unique, I would point out that we used to think that the Earth was the center of the universe. Then we discovered it went round the sun. Then we discovered that our sun goes round the black hole at the center of our galaxy. It takes about 220 million years to do a loop of the galaxy. And then we discovered, so we're a small planet around an unremarkable star in the suburban corner of our galaxy, and our galaxy is a fairly average galaxy and average in size. So, if life can evolve here in not a particularly unusual, locality, I imagine it can evolve in all sorts of places. Let's hope so.
Ah, pretty lovely. So, heading on, I don't know, would you like to talk about like science and more general questions? Because in your opinion, do the ecological relationships of the animals you studied have something to teach us about like what human beings should do in their relationship with other living beings and the environment? Because, well, anyways, we're talking a lot about conservation efforts here.
So I think certainly we are part of nature. There's no doubt about that. We evolved from nature. We are a species like every other species, and we're a product of the environments that our ancestors experienced. Whether we can look at other animals and plants and say, well, this is how we should behave, I don't know. But I do think one thing that is really emerging and has emerged in recent years is increasing evidence that other animals are conscious and have, maybe not as conscious as we are. I think we are an outlier. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But that other species have a degree of consciousness. And in most of nature, things lie on a continuum. So whether it's going from a very small animal right the way through to a very large animal like a blue whale, you know, there's a continuum of body size. And I suspect there's a continuum of consciousness. And I think that more and more evidence is coming to light to suggest that animals have a degree of consciousness. Even quite primitive animals that we shared a common ancestor with a very long time ago, like octopus, they appear to have a degree of consciousness and they appear to be quite intelligent. Now, given those findings, I think that does mean we should reassess how we treat other animals, because if they are conscious and they're just not you know, automatons going around and doing this, then we should treat them as conscious organisms that can and experience fear and can experience pain. And so I think that's one thing that science has told us about the natural world. I think the other thing, and we talked about this recently, that we can learn is we know that ecosystems can exist in lots of different states. We adapted and we evolved out of ecosystems that we're really significantly changing. And I think there's some risks to that. We don't really know what the consequences are of when we change ecosystems, of where they're going to go and what they're going to look like. And we may, if we continue on the routes that we're going down, we're already starting to do this. Oh, sorry. I'll take that later. Sorry, my phone was just ringing. I'll take that later. But I think one of the things that we can learn there is that if we muck up the earth too much, we might make it no longer. We might not be as well adapted to survive in it as we are in the world we live in at the moment. So I think those would be the lessons that I would take. I mean, on the longer term, I would say, well, you know, humans have the fate of every other species, which is extinction. So we will go extinct. Life will survive when that happens, after that happens. So maybe we shouldn't worry too much, but we like to put ourselves in the center of everything.
Excellent response. So, in terms of evolutionary biology, specifically again, out of all lines of study and evidence, in your view, what is the strongest evidence for universal common ancestry?
Oh, I think that's an easy one. There's no doubt that Luca, the last universal common ancestor, existed probably about 3.9 billion years ago. It was a species that used the same genetic code that we use today. And we know that because all of life uses the same genetic code. You know, and the fact that all of life uses the same genetic code, the same code to make the same amino acids. I think there's one species that's got a flip, but only one. But you know, the fact that evidence is absolutely compelling, that we are all you know, on the same tree of life. We have all descended from a last universal common ancestor called Luca that used the same genetic code as us. I mean, there's no doubt about that, none at all.
Well, in my opinion, a less informed person, but I believe that evolution and development is probably my favorite area of evidence, because we can not only reconstruct the relationships and the phylogenetic aspect, but also the processes, both in an ontological and phylogenetic level. And
Yeah.
I love that line. So I would like also to know, reminding of the example that we use here of Lachesis muta, that now have been proposed and proved, in fact, new species, Lachesis hombeata. What would be the limit that prevents microevolutions, so-called, from accumulating into a macroevolutionary process?
So macroevolution is just microevolution played for a sufficiently long time. And body shapes can evolve, metabolic rates can evolve, you know, new proteins and new uses for proteins can evolve through mutations. And so, you know, we know how selection works. We know that microevolution is mainly selection, shuffling, standing, genetic variation. You're not waiting for new mutations to rain down. What happens with on longer time scales is mutations accumulate. The majority of them are deleterious, but some of them are positive. And those mutations are not just point mutations. They can be inversions, they can be deletions, they can be insertions, they can be whole chromosome copying. All of those things go on. We understand how those things go on, and then selection works its magic. And I think there's no, that's, we, as I said, evolution is a fact. We know how it works. We know how to measure selection. We know what selection is. We know how mutations accumulate. And in some species, some areas, including the guppies that I work in, evolution is predictable. It's repeatable. It's predictable. Certainly phenotypic evolution. We can't tell you which mutations are going to occur because those are random. But we do know there are also multiple different genetic routes to get to the same phenotypic endpoint. So yes, it's this whole debate about, well, macroevolution is in somehow different from microevolution. Macroevolution is just microevolution over a very long time.
Well, I believe there are only a few exceptions of processes like hybridization, genome duplication, genome rearrangement, as has been detected in the Cervus genus, I believe, because it's in cervids.
Yeah.
So mostly of evolution, you can imagine the gradual steps. Only very few moments, sometimes very big moments, like the emergency of eukaryotes we got that
Yeah.
punctuated equilibrium.
Of course, these, so there are every now and again an event happens there, where, as you say, where a failed predation event of an early eukaryote on a primitive bacteria led to mitochondria. Interestingly, that also happened in plants to produce chloroplasts. So it's an event that's happened twice. Things like the evolution of flight was a game changer. I like to call them game changer traits. So they actually, they're traits that lead to major changes on ecosystems and the way the world work. But again, the emergence of flight, although it happened reasonably quickly, it was just adapting existing appendages, first of all, to glide and then to be able to do flapping flight. The evolution of the human brain is another trait that kind of has changed the world. And that's basically through extended development of the neocortex and the cortex, and so that's what gives us our intelligence. That what gives us language, allows us to have language. And those traits, yes, they do occasionally occur, but they normally grow through just making more of a type of cell, or what have you. So yes, there are punctuated changes, often caused by extinction, but generally generally evolution proceeds relatively slowly. Well, macroevolution proceeds relatively slowly, waiting for the reign of new mutations that are the fuel for producing new traits and what have you.
Yes, I believe that what I like most about these punctuated examples is that they are very clear and how species can form, like how we can isolate populations in distinct functional and highly morphic units.
So I think, it was a very popular argument, punctuated equilibrium, and what you do see is after a mass extinction, you end up with a burst of new diversity emerging. And that's again as life finds a way to produce new niches. There's no doubt about that. I'm not sure I particularly find the distinction between punctuated equilibrium and gradual evolution particularly exciting, to be honest, these days, because I think we understand the processes, and it's just that you've ended up, as I say, getting to a point when you've got a trait that gives one species or one group of species a significant advantage over the others. The ability, for example, of bacteria that were able to use oxygen as a fuel rather than having it as a poison that killed them after the great oxygenation event, I think again is, you might say that's punctuated equilibrium, but I think the environment had just changed to a point where it was possible for those things to evolve. And I think that, I'm not sure I think a few years ago that debate was very popular. I don't find it quite as compelling or as exciting as I used to.
Oh, okay. I may say that I found it exciting mainly because we can use as a very clear example for people who are denying speciation or this kind of biodiversity increasing processes. But I believe your time may be short for this interview. So would you like to go on and talk about pseudoscience?
We can do that a little bit. What I would just like to say is I think the great thing about science is we can have these debates, and then when more data are collected and more information comes in, if if it turned out that there's very strong evidence of clear punctuated equilibrium, I would absolutely accept it, and I think that's the most important thing about science. But let's move on, because I've got about another 5 or 10 minutes, so if that's okay to talk about pseudoscience, let's do that.
Oh, so just the final comment on that topic. I'm all the way through gradualism, only that punctuated equilibrium is just some events that I believe the time spans are very, very clear on what's happening in the population dynamics. And I would like to cite reticulated speciation, reticulated evolution as an example. Professor of mine, which has been a personal friend before being my professor, has used the exact example in our classes, and I believe there was beautiful example of in-lab speciation and in nature speciation. So, going to the pseudoscience, how do we combat pseudoscience and promote quality information in the internet? Like, what do you believe that should be our focus is to attack the philosophy of the argument, to attack the science specific, like the epistemology?
So, it's as I kind of said before, we live in an age where too many people get their information that they believe are facts from corners of the web, whether they're publications or Twitter, where people are saying whatever they want and there's no fact checking. Now, in days gone by, you knew that if you knew where you would go to buy a newspaper where you could read articles written by serious journalists who had done their work and who had gone and read up on things, or you would be able to go and buy books that were written by people that you trusted, who were who were experts in a particular area. Unfortunately, because social media is so addictive and people like those snippets of information that you can get, a tweet just being, I can't even remember how many characters it is, 256 characters or whatever. You can't say very much in it. And people, when they're only going there, they can choose and pick what they read. And they also end up falling into groups, into networks of people with similar views who are saying the same sort of thing. One of the reasons they then do it is they then want people to disagree with them and actually they end up promoting their view because they say, look what this idiot's written, and start challenging that view. Now, hopefully, social media is here to stay. My view is there probably do need to I'm all for freedom of speech, but there certainly needs to be rules to stop hate speech and dangerous misleading information. I mentioned vaccines earlier. I think vaccines are known to work. They're an incredibly powerful bit of science and they save lives. That people are out there saying that vaccines don't work and are trying to persuade people and not to have vaccines that could save their lives. I think that's criminal behavior, quite frankly. I think it's utterly unacceptable and utterly appalling. We saw a lot of it during COVID. So sometimes fake news doesn't matter, but in cases where it does and people are undermining things like vaccines that work incredibly well, it's extremely dangerous. Or they're denying things like climate change, which is something that we should be trying to address. Again, I think things like that are dangerous and are unacceptable, and we do need ways of coming up with dealing with it. And I suppose as scientists, what we should do is, and I think guys are doing a great job by having podcasts where you're talking to to scientists and you're talking to them about things they work on and their level of expertise, hopefully people will listen to these podcasts and watch these podcasts. And so I think we have to try and counter the fake news and the pseudoscience with the real science. But sometimes if people are not getting very much traction and no one's really listening to them, it's probably just best to ignore them.
Okay, I get it, and mostly I agree on, but there is a kind of a big problem here in Brazil. So I believe that in the US is the other major country with that same issue. There is spread of intelligent design and other modern kinds of creationism, mainly biblical creationism. So I'll need to make like two questions and only one. What do you think about people who are using their degree to propagate pseudoscience and many times using the name of their universities? And what do you say to someone who is spreading on the internet some things about evolution that don't accept common ancestry? And some of the two main arguments are that evolution will be circular reasoning, main to the parts of natural selection and phylogenetics, and the waiting time problem. Yes, yeah, we are in 2024, and there are still people using the waiting time problem against evolution.
So, I mean, what would I say about them? I would say that if they've been to a good university and education and a university where evolution has been taught and where, science has been taught, and if they end up walking away and still talking about new age creationism or something like that, they're clearly not very clever. They're clearly not very smart people because they've failed to understand what they've been taught. And obviously no reputable university is going to support them or encourage them. And it's appalling like that. And I believe there is someone who did his PhD at Oxford who's now in Brazil who's championing these things, and it's incredibly disappointing. But he clearly didn't learn very much when he was in Oxford. That's all I can say. I mean, we were teaching him, what evolution was, and he clearly didn't understand it. And unfortunately, there's not much we can do about that. I think we teach quite well, but we just ended up with someone who was incapable of learning and weighing up the evidence, and that was a great shame. But that doesn't, that's just, it could have come, someone like that could have come from any country. A few of them get through, but by far the vast majority of people are sensible. They understand the evidence. They understand how to assess the evidence. They understand what science is. But sometimes, sometimes there are people who just don't seem to have the mental capacity to learn these things.
Well, love to reply, and I would like to add that what probably gets me the most about these guys is that they're using many times some valid research, but that valid research only addresses a single topic with actual validity, like the waiting time problem itself. It is only valid in a very small window of genetic possibilities and ignores a whole multitude of things like the evolution of these proteins. And circular reasoning is one of the main arguments, not only by the guy who came from Oxford, but by many, many proponents of intelligent design who are very keen to philosophy.
So here's a thought experiment for you. If it is important for people to come up with alternative hypotheses. There's no doubt about that. That's how science works. We have to challenge things. Now, if there was any evidence for creationism or intelligent design or any of these newfangled, ill thought through, misguided beliefs, anyone who came up with convincing evidence for that was also consistent with all of the evidence that we've got now would win a Nobel Prize. But these people are publishing in places you've never heard of. They're not publishing in the main scientific literature. So it's absolutely fine for them to come up with theories, but they have to accept the existing evidence and any theory that they come up with has to be consistent with that evidence. And if you were able to say, look, I have proof that everything that we've got, from whether it's geology, from whether it's physics, whether it's chemistry in terms of isotope decay, if they can come up with evidence that shows that all of that is wrong, they would become the world's most famous scientists. They would have prizes. They would, everyone would praise them and say how clever they are. But they don't come up with any evidence. It's just nonsense, and it's not supported, and it's not consistent with everything else. So that's why they are dismissed by most practicing scientists and most people who've got any scientific education at all. They're welcome to do it, but if they were proper scientists, they would realize they don't have the evidence. They would give up on the hypothesis and they would start coming up with some new hypotheses. But they don't do that because they just want to believe. They feel that that's what they've got to do. But don't call it science. It's not science. It's nonsense or non-science.
One of my favorite evidences for evolution is that when you use the molecular clock and this DNA or molecular methodologies, when you find the coalescence points and the characteristics that the creatures should have, it kind of gets in line almost perfectly with the fossil record. Two completely different evidence lines
Exactly.
heading to the same point. So
exactly.
yeah, I believe your time is short. If you get my time, we would love to talk about you and your work a bit more. But if don't,
maybe
I
one
believe
more
that
question. Why don't we do one more question and then
Nice.
I should go. I have to cook a barbecue tonight, so yeah, one
Yes.
more question.
Fantastic. Just a bit. Vocês têm alguma proposição? Porque as perguntas importantes que eu tinha aqui, de dúvidas minhas de fato, já estão sanadas.
Já tá no finalzinho. Não sei se o Cristiano tem alguma coisa. O Minigídio fez uma pergunta lá essencial ali. Aí vocês vê, pra gente finalizar, né?
O que o Menegídio falou?
Bom, ele basicamente... tá. O que eu vi aqui foi um comentário, né? So, a science, a Brazilian science, Fabiano Menegídio, which is also evolutionary biology. I don't know if I say defender, but he propagates a lot of excellent information about evolutionary biology specifically, but biology in general, and his own studies, has said, Tim, you have no idea how crucial your contribution is to Brazilian science communication. And I sign at it perfectly. It is true, because sometimes when you are in the academy, you don't have exact idea on how your work is impacting people who are not working directly on your field, but are getting inspired, are learning from you. And I gotta say, the work on the wolves of Yellowstone is a textbook example for, I believe, almost every single discipline of ecology around the world.
So what was the question? Sorry, there was some typing going on. I think.
Oh no, it was not exactly a question. It was just a commentary.
Okay, yeah, okay.
But I believe Cristiano has a last question.
Não, só, de repente, o que o Tim teria para dar para a gente, jovens divulgadores científicos aqui no YouTube, alguma dica para a gente manter a inspiração e continuar nessa luta, nesse caminho de realmente tentar propagar a boa ciência e tal. Se ele tem algum conselho para esses jovens aqui da internet no Brasil, para a gente seguir nesse caminho.
Oh, it will be if you, by your experience, would have some tips for the young people who are now working on science propagation, like the good science, working on evolution and in other areas about the history of life, the history of Earth, and the universe, because we're facing a lot of backlash by some communities here in our country, mostly religious communities. But I believe we got a beautiful work to do, but we may need some guidance, some tips of someone who's working not only in science promotion for the public, but also for the academy.
so I think I think throughout the world that having a good science education is the route to having a chance of having a very good job. You know, understanding science and understanding maths, I think, as a young person, it really opens up the opportunity, because it not only is it a way to think and a way to collect evidence, certainly within, you know, as the world develops and technology becomes ever more important, I think employers are looking for people with scientific backgrounds and scientific training more and more. And so I think the message is, and I think one of the message, you know, what I would say is, if you enjoy science at school and you enjoy mathematics at school as a young person, anyone can be a scientist and anyone can be a mathematician. We're all scientists at heart. We find things out by trial and error, and the scientific method is just a way of taking that the way that we solve problems and formalizing it. And if I can be a scientist, then anyone can be a scientist. You know, it's and it's a great way to learn things and to learn about the world. And so I think the thing to do is, when we talk about science, we should be encouraging, we should be upbeat, we should tell the positive stories, and we should explain how it's helped us. And I have the best job in the world, right? And being a scientist and doing research and finding out new facts, finding out things that no one has known before, and then telling the world about it. I mean, what better life than that? Hey, it's fantastic.
I agree 100%. We got one of the most beautiful and exciting jobs in existence, and I would like to thank you very, very, very much, very, very deeply, for finding some
Very
time
much.
in your schedule to talk with us, to talk to our followers, because your job is very important. It's been very well done, and we gotta promote exactly this kind of person and this kind of work. Those who are
Thank you.
taking science seriously.
Thank you very
Sorry.
Thank you very much for having me on the podcast. It's been really enjoyable. I've enjoyed it, and you know, at any point in the future, if we want to do it again, just let me know. I'd be happy to.
Fantastic. That is exactly what I will ask you following up, because we can make a little bit more specific content, because this was mainly an introduction to your job, and I believe that there is a huge potential for promoting. So we count on you whenever may be possible, whenever you can fit in your schedule. We'll be up here, happy again to be able to talk to you.
I look forward to hearing from you, and thank you very much.
So,
Thank you very much.
Thank
Congratulations.
you, Tim.
Obrigado.
Okay.
congratulations for your job.
Okay, thank you. Great job.
Encerra, pessoal.
Pode encerrar.
Galera, próxima live a gente vai fazer já a reação. Valeu, pessoal. Já tô transferindo. Fui.